Etymological origins in the concept of law, lex, leges, the Roman concept of legitimacy at first referred to only a specific domain of private law, inheritance and testaments. Today it has become one of the most important concepts of political thought, referring to the foundation and validation not only of legal orders, but of whole regimes. As currently used, the concept has sociological, political, and ethical dimensions, the connection of all of which remains an unfinished task. Even more serious is the problem that although we live in an age where democratic legitimacy seems to be dominant, oligarchic authoritarian regimes as well as movements remain effective in exploiting and even rallying against its principles. Originally in Roman law, legitimacy had to do only with the inheritance of property in cases where wills were silent or unclear or contrary to law concerning the person of the inheritor. Hereditas legitima referred to the property itself, while heres legitimus and legitima heres indicated the inheritor according to the existing law, not necessarily a family member. In a very few texts, always referring to kingship, the concept was directly transferred into the political domain, as in Livy, who has one claimant to the throne of the early monarchy, Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, fiercely declared, and I'm quoting from the translation, that he was occupying his father's seat, that a king's son was a much more legitimate heir, heres legitimus, much more legitimate heir to the throne than a slave. While this text seems to link legitimacy and heredity, Tarquin's actual argument in Livy in fact contested the conditions of election of Servilius Tullius and charged him with political usurpation at the beginning of a long and successful reign. Usurpation of monarchical power was one of the meanings of tyranny to both Greeks and the Romans, but it was only one of these next to ruling against the laws and in the personal interest of the tyrant. In the classical and medieval Latin texts, whenever legitimacy is used in a political sense, the contrast is almost invariably with tyranny, and it seems never the other two Aristotelian political deformations, oligarchy and democracy. In different authors, the meaning shifts among the three dimensions, coming to power in a legal manner, ruling legally, and in the common interest. Dynastic heredity was only one legitimate option, since there was always the possibility of elective kingship, and even a dynastic heir could become a tyrant and hence illegitimate in the Aristotelian canon of the scholastics. The conception was applied on different sides of great political struggles, with kings, emperors, and even popes denounced as illegitimate and having to assert and justify their legitimacy. In terms of the universally shared political theology of the European Middle Ages, all three dimensions of legitimacy indicated expressions of the divine will, while violating any of its dimensions was not only tyrannical, but also, and even worse, sacrilegious. In the midst of religious civil wars during the formation of the modern concept of sovereignty, the element of dynastic succession was further downplayed. In Baudin's definition of royal or legitimate monarchy, there are various right ways of coming to power, including election. The model was very permissive, and even seizing the throne through conquest could be made legitimate by the just manner of rule. I'm quoting from Baudin, monarchies cannot be distinguished one from the other by the method of succession, but only by the way they are conducted. While on the anti-absolutist side, the monarchomags did not seem to have a different concept of legitimacy. They too stressed the manner and quality of rule, even if, unlike Baudin, they put emphasis on conformity with religious desiderata. Nevertheless, with the consolidation of territorial kingships, each imperator in regno suo, emperor in his own realm, the dynastic potential in a concept derived from the law of testaments eventually came to the fore. In the doctrine of divine right, God's will is the source of all political legitimacy and is manifested both in dynastic descent and the commands of the monarchical sovereign. To be sure, this view is continually contested by the aristocratic opposition and later by the universalist doctrines of various Enlightenment thinkers. Rousseau's ringing declaration and fundamental question, I'm quoting him, man is born free and everywhere he's in chains, what can make it legitimate? The declaration and the question were the results of a long 18th century development. Nevertheless, Rousseau may have been the very first to raise the question of legitimacy addressed to all political formations and regimes. His answer should be well known. All the classical forms of government can be legitimate if resting on the foundations of popular sovereignty, understood as a democratic legislative power. Yet in spite of the efforts of American, French, and Latin American revolutionaries, this new principle of normative legitimacy did not become universal, at least not then. Another equally important innovation stood in the way. Superficially, the concept of legitimacy introduced by Talleyrand at the Congress of Vienna was only a restoration of the old Roman heredity-based concept with usurpation as its contrary. Yet new meanings were involved. First, dynastic legitimacy could no longer be based on religion in an age when, according to Talleyrand, religious sentiment has been dramatically weakened. Second, tradition and longevity could play a legitimating role, but this in principle was as true for a republic like the Swiss Federation as the main European dynasties. It was a contingent fact that in Europe in 1814, most traditional claims were made on behalf of dynasts. Third, restoration could work as far as Talleyrand was concerned only with the support of what he called public opinion. Thus, legitimacy was based on, if not yet fully identified with, belief in legitimacy. This belief, according to Talleyrand, fourthly, is not a one-time thing and thus needs to be reproduced by important concessions to liberal institutions, mainly written constitutions and representative bodies. Finally, in an environment in which the traditional forms of rule have been upended by revolution, war, and usurpation, the restoration of legitimacy became an international, or rather inter-European task. Thus, legitimacy was now also supposed to be a function of recognition by other legitimate powers. Thus, the concept of legitimacy of Talleyrand was sociological and political as against the normative ethical concept introduced by Rousseau. The most important single author on the problem of legitimacy, Max Weber, adopted and further developed the sociological conception. He too considered belief in legitimacy more relevant to the sociologist of forms of Herrschaft or domination than normative justification. Yet of Talleyrand's model, he adopted only what he called traditional legitimacy. Given his belief in power politics and international affairs, legitimacy through interstate recognition played no role in his conception. But traditional legitimation is only one option, as it is well known to Weber. His sociology of religion taught him that next to tradition, there is also innovation, that priesthood and ministry in moments of crisis are confronted by prophecy. Prophecy thus became the prototype of Weber's famous charismatic legitimacy, not restricted anymore than tradition to purely religious phenomena. Finally, deeply influenced by legal positivism and that fully identified legality and legitimacy and sought to exclude all ethical normative elements from law, Weber added legal rational legitimacy, but only as a third form whose development rested on rational hierarchical administration and on procedural formalization and predictability in the formation of law. Weber's highly influential framework has been criticized on a number of interrelated points from the very beginning. First and most obviously, the three types of legitimate domination could obviously not be accepted as exhaustive. Weber's attempt to reduce democracy to a type of charisma never fully worked, in spite of the existence of plebiscitary forms combining elections and leadership. While he has made interesting observations regarding nationalism, there was no way to integrate the demand of the congruence of nation and state and the homogeneity of rulers and ruled into his doctrine. It was moreover justly asked by many whether legality on its own could ever legitimate, a doubt implicit in Kelson's famous concept of the Grundnorm that has only raised the question of legitimacy without providing any answer to it. Here too, the absence of democratic legitimacy seriously threatened the framework. The kind of conflicts between legality and legitimacy articulated by Carl Schmitt could not find a place in Weber's conception. Finally, the comprehensive sociological framework of Weber had little connection to fundamental critical questions asked ever since Rousseau about the legitimacy of legitimacy, established on purely factual foundations of empirical beliefs. These doubts could lead to proposals to abandon the concept of legitimacy. As we know from Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, however, a theory can and should be abandoned only when a stronger conceptual replacement is available. I will not now discuss whether theories based on raw power, cost-benefit analysis, or their combination could do the job of explaining the stability of regimes and the force of the challenges they all face. At least at a conference focusing on political concepts, we should all assume that concepts, arguments, and symbolic resources more generally all matter. But there are alternative concepts that take the role of cultural meanings in politics seriously. As a theory of the role of symbolic commitments in politics, the concept of authority is, however, significantly narrower than legitimacy, more tied to specific persons who can authorize and can be regarded as authors, and with its affinity to traditional forms of status and prestige, cannot account for the symbolic integrations of modern systems or the power and influence of unauthorized movements and initiatives. At most, authority is a special concept within a wider theory of legitimacy. To my mind, therefore, only the concept of hegemony, as developed by Gramsci, is a possible competitor of Weber's legitimacy. They both share the fundamental assumption that naked domination doesn't work without supporting ideas that achieve consent. Gramsci's theory, moreover, has the advantage of greater fluidity and potentially greater inclusiveness. With his concept of passive consent, Gramsci is not as focused on the administrative staff as Weber in one version of his argument, and it has a concept of counter-hegemony whose counterpart Weber did not develop in spite of his detailed knowledge of the relevant phenomena. Gramsci is more conscious of hegemonic conflicts than is Weber. Nevertheless, Gramsci's hegemony has some important weaknesses too. Unlike Weber, his alternative concepts of hegemony are not organized around central symbolic cores. Thus, we cannot easily tell when one model of hegemony replaces another. Gramsci also did not develop the organizational assumptions linked to different models of hegemony, nor did he fully understand the relation of specific options of hegemony building to larger cultural context. Aside from religion, and in that department, he is certainly no match for Weber. If anything, because of his implicit historical optimism or even determinism, Gramsci is further than even Weber from linking normative and empirical concerns. Thus, while a synthetic combination of Weber and Gramsci may be highly desirable, the replacement of legitimacy by hegemony would be hardly justified. Interestingly, perhaps because of their common neglect of normative legitimacy, neither Weber or Gramsci understood democracy as the most general and almost inescapable legitimating idea of our age, as did Carl Schmitt, who was certainly no Democrat. The dynastic legitimacy that Talleyrand sought to revive on modern grounds, when exposed to his own test of public opinion, collapsed already in the 19th century, and then definitely with the end of the old European empires in World War I. Our kings and queens are comic book characters that some people keep around and support for purposes of public entertainment. Thus, Schmitt already proposed to conservatives and legitimists of all sorts to put their trust in dictatorship that could be established on plebiscitary democratic grounds. While his intuition concerning dictatorship on democratic foundation turned out to be initially, or at least partially, time-bound, the emphasis on plebiscitary democracy that he shared with Weber turned out to be far more prescient. Our representative democracy is less aristocratic today than based on mass or media democracy. The homogeneity, too, that Schmitt understood as essential to democratic aspirations is an important clue to the internal relationship of democracy and nationalism. Since modern mass democracy is likely to be representative in any plausible model, the potentially aristocratic or oligarchic meaning of representation can be diminished by the assumption of the cultural similarity of representatives and the represented. That type of homogeneity is accomplished by the mass media. Nationalism, too, is ultimately based on the very same idea that was irrelevant in a pre-democratic age. Even religious fundamentalisms in societies where religion and popular piety remain overwhelming features of life, in the rebellion against secular and often nationalist elites, are parasitic upon the democratic idea of homogeneity. Admittedly, nationalist regimes, and hopefully ones based on religious fundamentalisms, are exposed to conflict based on their implicit democratic assumptions. This has always been true of democracy based on rights and representation that has been often and repeatedly unmasked as elite democracy. Homogeneity, contrary to Schmitt, is not the only democratic value or even the main one. It is ultimately an idea of ersatz participation that cannot entirely eliminate what it replaces. When the ultimate meaninglessness of being ruled by your own kind or your own nation or your own religious affiliation becomes clear, other democratic demands can surface. What these are can be discovered only by normative and in part counterfactual theory. Thus, the idea that democracy is the fundamental legitimating idea of the age can be taken also in the normative sense that will help exploring the legitimation deficits of nationalist, plebiscitary, religious, and of course also liberal democracy. It is in this sense that Habermas's idea of operating both with normative and empirical concepts of democracy can still be supported. This idea has both an epistemological and a critical sense. The first is based on the hermeneutic assumption that the shared background idea of democratic legitimacy allows us to understand different types of beliefs and claims, none of which in the absence of modern alternatives can fully escape the normative compulsion of that background. At the same time, the normative concept of democracy helps us not only better reconstruct the meaning of various empirical forms, but also to find the points of weakness open to challenge on the part of democratically motivated actors. While the idea of a legitimation crisis cannot be justified by a primarily normative theory, the original, less sensationalistic title of Legitimation's Probleme allows us to better understand the symbolic conflicts that we can actually discover not only in late capitalists but also all modern societies. For a democratic theory of legitimation to be able to accomplish its own critical tasks, it must also be self-critical. Why does the idea of democratic legitimacy so often open up the door to various populisms, majoritarian and plebiscitary democracy? The answer, I think, lies with a concept that many take as the synonym of democratic legitimacy, namely popular sovereignty. This concept can have minimal and maximal, negative and positive meanings. In the minimal sense, it connotes the legal equality of all citizens and perhaps also the linkage of every political status in the state to an election. There is little to object to in this version except to indicate the poverty of minimalism. But maximally, the concept of popular sovereignty means that the people as a whole are supposed to make the fundamental decisions in political life that they actually ought to rule. Given the impossibility of identifying the people as a whole from the very beginning of its supposed sovereignty, and even more explaining how such an actor can act and decide, the concept allows for two major interpretations. One of these is admission of its fictional, in other words, counterfactual character. The other is the frank espousal of the myth, along with the search for embodiments in empirical agents who are able and can successfully claim the right to speak in the name of the new Deus absconditus. Again, the fiction can be relatively harmless if coupled with a negative interpretation, namely the denial that any person, group, or institution can speak in the name of what is always and necessarily hidden. This is the now famous idea of democracy as an empty space. It can be distinguished from a minimalist polyarchy by the insistence on principles that in some way can bring the fiction closer to reality. The already mentioned legal equality and deriving offices from elections are such principles, along with fundamental rights, the separation of powers, and the maintenance of an open public sphere. An active judicial review, sensitive to popular inputs, is yet another such principle. Yet the alternative idea of embodiment is very harmful and can easily lead to the introduction of political institutions incompatible even with the minimal concept of sovereignty, of popular sovereignty. Unfortunately, in the horse race between interpretations, the negative idea of popular sovereignty, shored up by a variety of democratic principles, and a positive notion of embodiment in popular leaders, movements, institutions, supported by majorities or highly mobilized minorities. In that horse race, the latter idea often has a better chance. This is especially so in revolutions when some elite or movement can claim the mantle of liberation on behalf of the popular sovereign. Short of revolutions, populist movements are often successful in making similar claims. The very vagueness of their ideologies, the political theological nature of the construction of reality, their insistence on radical friend-enemy confrontation, and the availability of leaders with genuine appeal can all give populists the advantage in the competition with liberal democracy and its well-known deficiencies. The domain of constitution making is a particularly favorable terrain for populist politics. There are even authors who admit that in normal politics the people can be said to be present only through intermediaries, none of whom alone are entitled to speak in the name of the whole. Yet they wind up arguing that to legitimate the framework within which the people are ruled by elected officials, the constituent power requires the real presence of the sovereign. Variants of this view have been proposed by Bruce Ackerman, Joel Cohen-Rias, and even my friend Andreas Kalyvas. More importantly, constitution makers in several countries, including some constitutional courts, have also taken the position that the popular sovereign, embodied in referendum or plebiscite, can be directly the carrier of the original constituent power. It is true that an alternative idea of a plurality of principles of democratic legitimation in constitution making is available today. It has been developed first in Spain, continued in Central Europe, and was very much improved upon in South Africa. The method shares with all the theories of the constituent power the stress on constitution-making process, as against the method of imputation proposed by liberals, who assume that only the result, a constitutionalist constitution, matters for democratic legitimacy. But the new method replaces the idea of a unitary subject of the constituent power by the supposedly united people acting to a single organ like a constituent assembly by a set of legitimating principles: plurality, inclusion, publicity, legality, and consensus. To me, at least, it is these principles that add up to a modern concept of democratic legitimacy. Variants of this new method of the production of democratic legitimacy have succeeded in some unlikely settings like Colombia and Tunisia to overcome the populist seduction, at least so far. I call these contexts unlikely because of the revolutionary overthrow of the old regime in Tunisia and the dominance of ideas of the populist theories of the constituent power in Colombia as elsewhere in Latin America. In the same period, however, in broadly similar contexts, in Venezuela and Egypt, the populists have seemingly won the horse race. The same outcome has been achieved in Hungary and is likely to happen in Turkey under leaders claiming the right of a bare majority enabled by disproportionate electoral rules to radically replace constitutions. Again, we do not know if these results are definitive or irreversible. But we may safely assume that the horse race between the two ideas of democracy will continue in yet other places, perhaps without an end in an epoch of democratic legitimacy. What in conclusion I wish to get across is the point that although our age remains an age of democratic legitimacy, that hardly means that democracy has won its fight either with its own darker possibilities or even that it could not be challenged or even replaced all over the world by new alternatives. These alternatives feed not only on the failure of democracy or the repeatedly authoritarian outcomes of democratic claims, but especially on the gap between democratic legitimacy and institutional practices, or the inability of democrats to create institutions that would bring the fiction of popular sovereignty significantly closer to reality. Thank you very much.
My presentation is motivated by the desire of testing how our theories of democracy help us to make sense of crisis, of what is a crisis, of what citizens think about their actual democracies when they argue, they claim, they say that they are in crisis. So I would like to investigate the interpretation and strength of the concept of crisis in relation to this pragmatic understanding of that is applied to democracy. Why I do so? Because recently, particularly in the so-called consolidated democracy side of the planet, that is Europe, but not only Europe, essays and talks on crisis of democracy have boomed. Thousands, actually, of them have been published recently. And the growth of poverty, perhaps, inequality after several decades of expansion and consolidation of economic and social well-being, along with the plague of unemployment and the irreversible erosion of the welfare state, translates into a decline of citizens' confidence in democratic institutions. Within this context, two streams of analysis have been developed recently, one that connects the decline of trust in democracy with the decline of efficacy of the nation state at the expense of regional and global agencies, and another that situates it in a causal relationship with the transformations of capitalism. Both analyses are essential, and in a longer paper I discuss about them. They brought, among other, Klaus Hofer to conclude that while the social democratic project has been obsolete, nothing new has emerged that is able to replace it. Thus, we can say that we live in an interregnum, or in Gramsci's word, catastrophic equilibrium. This is what citizens sometimes name as a decline of democratic legitimacy. This is the complex context in which I situate my interest in the concept of crisis as a political concept, wherein I use the adjective political exclusively in relation to democracy. You had already years ago, I saw another scholar developing the concept, so I don't go through all these detailed literary analysis, but stick within this topic. So here is my basic assumption then. The assumption of the authority of the state upon which democracy developed in the modern times, these exhaustions, along with the decline of industrial capitalism as Fordism, these are important factors of crisis. However, they are not the same things as the crisis of democracy. Even if liberal democracy and social democracy were historically redefined after World War II, on two assumptions that are very problematic in themselves. That is, on the compatibility, on the one hand, between capitalism and democracy, below a lot of literature on that, and on the other hand, the compatibility between nation states, sovereignty, and democracy. So the crisis of democracy, in my view, regardless of this causal effect relationship with social and economic decline, is a phenomenon of its own rights that pertains to a political system, a political order, some specific procedures, institutions, and rules, which are distinct from the economic organization of society, although it is an historical fact that these two levels don't exist and cannot be understood apart from each other. So the question is that when we try to circumscribe the discourse of crisis to democracy, some might object that this doesn't promise to be very interesting. As a matter of fact, from at least the 18th century onward, there has been a persistent refrain of discourses of crisis in both specialized and non-specialized writings. So democracy's journey, after all, started along with the claim of a crisis, of his crisis, although it was only perhaps in the turmoil of the 1920s that the most dramatic discourse of crisis started to become very relevant. So crisis was then, in the 20s, fatal to the constitutional democracy. This is not what we experience today, even though discourses on crisis are booming. So contemporary diagnosis of crisis pertain today to the sphere of opinion, not the constitutional order. This is what makes any talk on crisis very tricky. Now, in the domain of politics, detection and proclamation of crisis, of democratic politics, lost rigor once democracy entrusted its legitimacy to a constitutional pact that sanctioned, organized, and limited the power of his institution. So Reinhard Koselleck chose thus to end his masterpiece, historical analytical reconstruction of the meanings of the concept of crisis, with the following words, and he wrote in 1982. Crisis remains a catchword, used rigorously in only a few scholarly or scientific contexts, and rightly so, because in the domain of politics, detection and proclamation of crisis lost rigor once democracy entrusted its legitimacy to the constitutional pact that, as I said before, organized and limited these institutions. So, unless the constitutional order is subverted or violated, detecting crisis becomes very problematic. Thus, the question I propose is the following. What do we mean when we speak today about a crisis of democracy? Or what kind of democracy do we refer to when we argue that democracy is in a crisis? In the hope of being able to offer a plausible, although tentative answer to these questions, I will first of all offer some clarification on the meaning of the concept of crisis and their application to democracy, and then I will list some main discourses about crisis in recent political theory literature, and finally I will propose some conclusions. So, writing for the last issue of the Journal of Democracy dedicated to this topic, the crisis of democracy, Philip Schmitter wrote that we should not talk about crisis, but we should, not talk about decline, but about crisis. Thus presuming that the crisis is a very clear guide and very easy term to be used. Yet the term crisis is far from clear and uncontested. So as we know, the Oxford Dictionary defines it in contemporary general parlance by going back to the late Middle English, when crisis started being used in medical language to denote the turning point of a disease. This medical and Latin root was meant to indicate a change in the status of a sick person from better to worse or vice versa. In the 19th century, Jacob Burckhardt adopted this meaning to question one-way interpretations, namely catastrophic developments, and to argue that, I quote, crisis may mean a permanent possibility in history. According to him, thus, there are phases of changes in the condition of a person or of a country, which are only rarely critical to the point of becoming catastrophic, that is, the death of the individual or the death of a regime. The same Oxford Dictionary mentions a second set of meanings of the Greek word krisis or crisis as decision, deriving from krinein, the site of cutting a knot, interrupting regularity or normality. Every time we have to decide we are in the condition of a crisis, since we have to interrupt the current doing with an act of the will that impresses a change. This was the sense used by Thucydides in relation to war, or by Carl Schmitt in relation to the decision as the testing power of the sovereign. In this sense, crisis means breaking, divorce, an act of the will, fight, and quarrel, all of which suggest a disjunction where our condition is either one thing or another. From the Greek comes also another third set of meanings, which is much more directly linked to democracy and which guides my presentation. That is judgment, trial, and critical attitude. Aristotle used them when he talked about the decisions made according to the procedures in the domain of justice, the kaion-krisis, and about the citizens as having the authority to make decisions, as arche kritike. The diarchy of discussion and collective deliberation defines this diarchy, these two, defines the status of political liberty, with the implication that crisis is most necessary for the community, representing what is at once just and salutary. This diarchy is crucial for me. Finally, the idea of crisis as judgment, Koselleck tells us, transmigrated through Latin and then to the Greek and Latin translation of the Old and New Testament that restated the identification of crisis with judgment, but in a completely new rendering as the last judgment or the apocalyptic expectations. The crisis as the end of the world of the world will finally bring us to a true justice. So in sum, the Latin, the Greek meanings of the concept of crisis suggest the following polysemy, for whose implication to politics and democracy are very interesting and fertile. First, a radical break, either-or situation, dictatorial, revolution, or whatever. Second, a process of political and juridical judgments that partakes of the system of decision-making in the constitutional government and is ingrained in political liberty. And third, a teleological judgment guided toward an end that is already written, or a new epoch, or a new order, or a catastrophic fatal end, or an apocalyptic scenario. It is also possible to derive from here two inferences, two ways of rendering this taxonomy in relation to democracy. In one sense, crisis is endogenous to this system since it denotes politics in its own right, as the art of by means of which we discuss and make decisions on public affairs and in public. And in another sense, crisis denotes a radical break, a situation of exceptionality and or emergency that can take a catastrophic characteristic, something that the constitutional democracy is not supposed to face. So we need to keep in mind all this rich constellation of meaning of crisis and politics when we approach the discourse about the sense of the crisis of democracy in our parlance. Yet again, to what kind of democracy we refer to when we diagnose a crisis? Presumably, the kind of democracy citizens refer to is one in which they live, a constitutional representative democracy. The institutions of this form of democracy started to be designed in the 18th century to allow the citizens to resolve peacefully their disagreements and conflicts, but without finding any final solution, never. So freedom, civil and political, and majority rule, break of the unanimity, are thus the principles and the procedure that characterize democracy, so that if one of the two declines, that would be a real sign of radical crisis that is not manageable with ordinary democratic procedures. This led scholars to argue that democratic regimes stand opposite to both permanent evolution and autocracy as final solutions to problems or conflicts. Yet within the democratic family, not all theories agree on considering majority rule as fundamental. To some, unanimity is the norm and majority rule the safety net when harmony is broken. So democracy as a process and democracy as a substantive ideal of unity are two very different ways of rendering democracy and different ways of rendering the crisis. An example of a substantive conception that has a great impact in today's discourse on crisis would be Samuel and Huntington's theory of clash of civilization, an ideological approach that assumes democracy is rooted in a unitary set of values, cultural, religious, national, that give meaning and strength to the political community and its government. Crisis, when emerges, is a catastrophe as it rests on an interpretation of democracy that has no procedure at its core, but cultural identity of some kind in relation to which procedures are essentially a technical method at most. To paraphrase Koselleck, we may say that this rendering of the crisis corresponds to a transfer to politics of the monotheistic meaning of crisis as final judgment, which projects history toward the eschatology of either salvation or damnation. Thus, it is not this view, but the procedural approach that can give us some useful guides to detect and interpret contemporary thoughts on the crisis of democracy. However, procedural conception is not a univocal family either. I would list three large groups within it: a minimalist or institutional view, a second, a deliberative view, and the third one that I mentioned at the beginning in relation to Aristotle, a diarchic view, conception. Let's see the minimalist one, Schumpeter and company. This may be defined as a status quo theory. Here is an example. The Trilateral Commission's report on the governability of democracies in 1975 with the title The Crisis of Democracy. The crisis of democracy was actually a crisis of governability provoked by the growth of social movements of contestation in almost all democratic societies. So, social democratic policies in Europe and the Great Society in the US were the outcome or the increase of state functions in the attempt to answer the claims from society. So this was an excess of democracy, there was, and that was a crisis. It could be stopped only by stopping social policies or repressing social movements or deflating them. So the status quo conception engendered the following paradox. It narrowed democracy to electoral procedures, yet could not make peace with the fact that those procedures would open the door to citizen participation and claims. So representation, after all, is a form of advocacy. The paradox revealed a lack of understanding of representative government, which is a hierarchy of both the right to vote and the right to formulate opinion. But in this case, instead, excess of democracy is part of the game. It's not a pathology, contrary to what the minimalists would think. So in the minimalist view, the crisis of governability could be stopped only by claiming, by containing participation from below and by interrupting the welfare state from above. Neoliberal dismantling of social policy today and the repressive state are the longue durée message of the Trilateral, the perfectionist project concealed under the detection of crisis of governability. In 40 years, that vision of democracy would become victorious. Today's decline of political participation and on social policies makes many consolidated democracy in the land of neoliberal perfectionism called minimalism. The deliberate theory is the alter of the anti-minimalist conception, and it is a branch of critical theory, and for this reason, naturally keen to make the concept of crisis a learning tool. Yet, critical theory presents us with an ideal vision of the democratic society that metabolizes crisis insofar as it effects a transition to a progressively more integrated society. Indeed, if democracy is defined as, according Habermas, as a rule of good reasons, and if this requires an institutionalized basic structure of justification in which reasons can be assessed among free and equal beings, then one may infer that democracy is permanently in a state of actualization of his ideal of a perfect integration of citizens as good reasoners, who are capable of and willing to transcend their partial views and correct their biases. So, whereas outlawed participation from below and the expansion of social programs by the state were the main concerns of the Trilateral, of the conservative, to Habermas, the concern is precisely the withdrawal of the citizens from reasoned deliberative participation and of the state from its commitment to take care of the condition for that participation. So factions on the one hand, particular interest on the other, in a word, political partisanship are the main expressions of a crisis because a symptom of a not well being integrated society in which impartial deliberation becomes a utopia at best and elections remain the only formal expression of autonomy. So a crisis that is no longer a learning tool is a crisis of social rationalization. This is Habermas. Partisan discourses, along with organized interest, prove that social and political groups take up the game of politics in order to make their view win the state. So party democracy corresponds to a battlefield-like politics in which the counting of votes only gives legitimacy to the institution. As an overturned minimalism, Habermas' theory presents us with a hierarchy of two models, a superior one, which corresponds to deliberative democracy, and the second best one, which narrows legitimacy to the electoral method and the majority rule. So, although deliberative theory claims against this dualism between ideal and real, the discourse of the crisis it implies invites us to think that the electoral and party democracy belongs to a non-ideal democracy, although it is a functional mechanism that sustains democratic institutions. The normative or ideal state of democracy is one of well-integrated society in which justification of claims is a duty toward others to be performed according to impartiality of judgment, sincerity, freedom from influence, and thus autonomy. In conclusion, the culture discourse, civilization, clash of civilization, the status quo discourse, and the deliberative discourse have this in common. They interpret the crisis as a failure of empirical democracies to impersonate or to match with or to adhere to an ideal model of unity or of perfect equilibrium or of rationality. None of them are content with accepting a conception of democracy as a permanent government of crisis. The first because it connects democracy with some strong substantive values. The second because it puts the Archimedean point within institutions so that any movement from outside is a crisis. And the third one because it has an innate, I'm sorry, I went too far away, it has an innate mistrust in conflicts, majority rule and party politics, which are at the most the second hand, not the best, which instead, according to me, are the structural condition of representative and parliamentary democracy. And here we are, and this is really the last part. As we saw at the beginning, Aristotle suggested a way out in a diarchic approach, the interconnection between discussion and decision, not deliberation for a rationalization, discussion as a condition of expression of our differences and imperfections, if we like. This interpretation of politics allows us to make sense of today's talk of crisis as not simply pure crisis or pure democracy, but of a specific kind of democracy, a parliamentary democracy based on parties. Today, we are in a crisis. In this case, representative democracy is a diarchy of two authorities that keeps in communication the procedures springing from elections and the free domain of doxa, discussion, political associations, and so on and so forth. No intention of rationalizing the domain of opinion or achieving an integrated general will, but the acknowledgement that citizens' judgment and the denunciation of ineffective decisions and social disunions are only possible within a political and legal system that has political autonomy of the citizens, thus voting and voice, at its core. Democracy is permanently a domain of critical politics. It is a solid democracy when and until citizens can mobilize and have some chances to press the system for or against politics they judge in agreement or in contradiction with the democratic premises. When this chance declines, we are entitled to talk about a crisis of citizenship power within a representative of parliamentary democracy. As the Greek minister, I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce well the name, Georgios Katragoulos, right? Said recently, if we cannot change economic policy through election, then elections are irrelevant. Elections are irrelevant, and it is useless to vote. He's right. Today's discourse on the crisis of democracy thus refers precisely to parliamentary democracy built on elections and political parties. And the very Greek demonstrations on May the 5th, 2010, in front of the parliament, they shout, burning down the parliament. I mean, of course, the Greek citizens had good reason to voice their criticism against their elected politicians and doubt about their power of voting. The parliamentary system is ingrained in a political sphere made by parties. The party is an association of citizens, I quote, which brings like-minded individuals together in order to secure them actual influence in shaping political affairs. This is Kelsen. Any effort to discredit the parties or to make them the power of the few notables represents a disclaim of democracy, at the end of democratic representative system as we know today. So, where we are going from here? We are going toward the conclusion that tells us that today, in fact, the real crisis has to do with this kind of representative democracy. Because as Andrew anticipated me before, because of the transformation of elections into plebiscite. That is, from choosing between parties or fighting over identification of party, now is simply a kind of plebiscite of the leader, which is another story. It's another kind of democracy. So the parliamentary system is ingrained in parties, and if you destroy them, you destroy this parliamentary system. Here we are again. I had a long section on Manen. I think I'm too late. How much I have?
Maybe 50 seconds.
50 seconds? Good. So I finish. Today there is a kind of happiness with the audience democracy, this metamorphosis from party democracy into audience democracy. Why so? In fact, if parties are, after all, an oligarchy, we know that, then why not to accept audience? Because it's more horizontal, is headless, is a large structured power. But this is indeed at the end of representative democracy, which is, according to me, a big disgrace, a great disgrace, because until now we don't know yet how to deal with organization of democracy as a form of government outside of institutions like elections and parties and so on and so forth, and majority rule. So, close. When citizens used to vote for parties with platform, they exercise their judgment on future politics. When they make or vote in a plebiscite, they instead judge on the character of the leader. They trust in the leader. They put themselves in the hand of the leader. So democracy, in this case, passes from parliamentary to plebiscitary. To conclude, today's crisis points to a rearrangement of the relationship between democracies to authorities, active participation and participation in the form of opinion. And ultimately, it is a decline of a particular type of democracy, parliamentary and party democracy. This is for. Finish.
Thank you. Gina?
Yeah, actually, I have a question for both, but the papers are so related that I think we'll have
One paper.
not a problem. Although there was a book written about the crisis of parliamentary democracy quite a while ago.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking in the same way.
Nevertheless, I think that Andy's paper is important because it conceptually distinguishes between legitimacy and authority, and I suspect that the importance of the avenues of participation in creating a constitutional democracy and an institutionalized regime of the sort that Nadia is addressing, the kinds of plurality and multiplicity of avenues of participation are also necessary once it is established. So the question would becomes if you want to avoid a minimalist framework. I mean, Andrew mentioned legal equality, election rights, all those things, but actually not what, of course, he's always written about, and also with me, the informal avenues of movements, etc., as constitutive of, not, as Nadia said, not as signaling a crisis, but as constitutive of participation in democracy. I mean, this we've sort of known for some time. The question, though, that I have, because so much is on the table, is the following. I'm not so sure, although I really want to. I'm not sure how we can conjure away, or if we can completely conjure away the question of substance and unity, or I guess you might say another formulation would be, and I don't know, another formulation might be consensus on, for example, the fundamental rules of the game. So in Greece, you could come up with all these arguments because the fundamental rules of the game rested on consensus and certain other homogeneities. So that the first question is, how much we can conjure that away, because of course Schmitt's crisis of parliamentary democracy referenced such a radical segmentation and utter lack of agreement on the ultimate rules of any rules, not the given ones, but any rules of the constitutional and political game, that there was no chance except for what would be ultimately anti-democratic, so plebiscitary. That's the first question. Then the second question has to do with we would need some criteria for distinguishing between those kinds of informal presences, I mean movements, etc., in the public sphere, that, and I'm not talking about violence, nonviolence, but I don't know whether it would be goals, but it's something we have to think about. So some criteria for distinguishing between those kinds of actions, demonstrations, etc., that really would undermine, and the goal would be, in some sense, to undermine and put in place a kind of homogeneity that would obviously rule out certain segments of the population and ultimately rule out democratic processes. So how to distinguish between those kinds of presences of actors, the demos, and the kinds that are actually would constitute or lead to or seek further democratization of our, rather oligarchic democracies and more justice rather than injustice. I think these are the two questions that the papers lead us to, and don't look at me for an answer.
Briefly, first, yes, I think first of all that the topic of the crisis of parliamentary democracy should be our topic, because this is the time we live in. I mean, it's obviously disappearing, and something else is coming out. We don't know yet what, but in the form of technocratic governance or in the form of plebiscitarian new leadership. This is an important topic. Question, substance and unity. Since I am in a permanent condition of crisis, as in Aristotelian sense, if there is a unity, this is ahead, not what. So we start with some agreements on how to disagree. Right. This is all. But if you put something more, then you end up truly by discriminating which on which. So for this reason, I tend to stay away with the kind of clash of civilization. This makes me truly more than nervous. The other one is the criteria. I don't know. This I am against. Personally, I think that I don't espouse and I don't agree with militant democracy. Not at all. Meaning, unless we don't use violence, we have to risk freedom. And political freedom means that there are also actors we don't like among us. And this is what we have to deal with. We cannot repress. Otherwise, we never stop repressing those we don't like. So we end up with one. The only one at the end remains me or you, perhaps. So for this reason, no. This is my answer.
Just very, very briefly, on this question of homogeneity. I mean, this is a very deep insight of Schmitt. Of course, he raised it to a kind of principle that Jean and I, most people here, won't accept. But the insight had to do with the fact that, and I think the way I put it is, that given the potentially aristocratic nature of representation, in fact, the structurally aristocratic nature of representation, you know historically where representation emerged from, aristocratic society, given that problem, it's difficult to achieve the identification of the ruled with the rulers without homogeneity. I mean, correct me if you don't think this is the right interpretation of Schmitt, but that's why I'm asking. He's Schmitt redivivus. But in any case, I think this is the idea. And this idea can't just be dismissed because of the deep flaws of representative democracy. Now, what Jean is raising then is which kind of homogeneity, right? If it is a homogeneity of an ethnic group, you get ethno-democracy or ethnocracy, right? I mean, that leads to that. Or if it is homogeneity of religion, you can get to some kind of theocracy. So I think I think you already said it, so maybe I'm just repeating, that maybe we should seek the homogeneity in procedural structures. In other words, republican structures all the way down, as one might say. And well, Schmitt didn't exclude that. He never really said what the homogeneity should be based on. And of course, if you could convert democracy into pure participatory democracy, which is somehow latent in the underlying idea, then of course you wouldn't need homogeneity because you'd have something better. But I think that is highly unlikely, and so in some sense the question of homogeneity cannot be just gotten rid of. Yeah.
Jason?
Yeah, my question is for Andrew, but I think it's relevant to both papers, and I think that some of the issues that Jean raised, my question kind of follows from them. And this question of the crisis of parliamentary democracy, and also kind of the Schmittian collapse of democracy into a kind of plebiscitary identification with the Caesarist leader. And so the question, Andrew, is about the way that you portray what you call a maximalist theory of popular sovereignty that has a relatively benign and safe manifestation in the kind of Lafleur empty space of power, and then you say there's a more dangerous form which you associate with embodiment, right? In other words, so debates around how we, I mean, this is the great Schmittian question. The question comes around how the popular will is formed, right? Now, it seems like both you and Nadia have, in being understandably worried about these questions of embodiment and the assumptions of homogeneity that they assume, have one idea of embodiment in mind, which is primarily a kind of Caesarist identification with a leader, right? And that's a very Schmitt, I mean, that's a part of the kind of Jacobin logic of democracy in Schmitt's work. But it seems to me that there's another way to get at that question. So this is my question to you. Like, isn't there another way of approaching that problem of embodiment where it is not simply resigning yourself to the empty space of power in the Lafleurian kind of way, but where it opens up a real discussion about how that popular will gets formed, institutionally represented, embodied. In other words, the limitations with existing parliamentary systems of representation should precisely be what is up for question, not falling back. I mean, I don't know if falling back from the party system and existing forms of representational democracy are enough, in other words. And keeping open that question of embodiment highlights that as the political question. That is the political question for the status, the democratic possibilities of contemporary politics. So it seems like that's maybe a less dangerous and a more democratically productive way of getting at these questions.
Let me start this time. It was a great question, but let me just correct one impression. I don't think that embodiment through an assembly or to a referendum or through a movement are ultimately less dangerous for democracy than in a leader. I think all of them can have very similar consequences, yet, of course, leadership too can have good consequences. I mean, this is empirically various, but I think embodiment, okay, but this doesn't change the meaning of your question. So what you're asking, I don't know, I think probably everybody's familiar with Edmund Morgan's Inventing the People, and of course, this argument was already produced by François Furet with respect to the French Revolution, others, Rosa Malone, Lefort, others follow him. The idea is that embodiment is benign to the extent that each embodiment can be challenged. If there's still a kind of public space where the embodiment of one can be challenged, remember how it went in Morgan, it was first the Long Parliament, then Cromwell's army, then the leader, in the end, Parliament again. It's always different embodiments which struggle in the same space over who has the right. I mean, it's a description of the revolutionary scenario. I think this is actually a good description. Of course, one should not forget what the costs are as one proceeds through this contest. I would say that I would easily go along with the idea that each form of embodiment should be contested when it appears, and it is part of a democracy to try to recover. But I think the idea that any of the stages is benign. Was Cromwell's army a benign claimant? Was a Long Parliament, a highly oligarchic institution, a benign claimant? Cromwell himself. Each stage itself is actually an authoritarian stage in some sense of the word. Now, I know Ernesto Laclau in his book on populism seems to suggest this alternative model of embodiment, but I've written a long article against it, and I think that that though it's a democratic model of sorts, it is not the one that, that we should ultimately go with.
I think, though, that we should recover a little bit more the classical idea of doxa and the relativity of all positions. This is the way to deal with the question of embodiment, of disembodiment. Even if you have different parties or different identification as embodiment, each of them are temporary in action, only temporary, because the doxa is an open condition for change. It's neither one or the other. And this makes us free as citizens. We should really recover that instead of going toward this unanimity or this ideological identification that is very thick. This sense of relativity of all positions that we have. We may not like it, and people don't like sophists. I tend to like more them than others because it is the idea of changing that democracy is very importantly connected to. So this is my...
Stafi?
My point is also addressed to both papers, which seem to be one. By the way, I'm struggling with myself in the sense that my point will be totally self-evident, but it is just don't answer it. By the discussion we had already, it seems that the concept that we are discussing is not legitimacy or crisis, but it's democracy. Okay.
Exactly.
This concept is the concept of your concepts.
Yes.
The strange thing about this concept is that it leads both your concepts into a conceptual impasse. And for the following reason, and I'm only talking concepts here, not real politics, if you permit me for a second. The advent of democracy, or the emergence of democracy into the history of legitimacy, creates it seems to me a very strange situation to legitimacy, because democracy is the only mode of politics that seeks legitimacy in itself. Yeah. And in a kind of almost tautological or radical self-referential mode. For this reason, it is always, and you've said it, both of you, in one way or another, always in a legitimation crisis. Yeah, right? Which one might say also reverse, if you can say reverse in a reverse sense, that legitimacy is sort of always the critical point of democracy. Or again, democracy throws the concept of legitimacy into crisis. All of these are different phrasings of the same situation. Now, as a result of this conceptual impasse of both crisis and legitimacy, democracy seems to the paradoxical consequence of that is to seek legitimacy in external forms and forces, which would be popular sovereignty or parliamentarism, constitutional order. I actually see those as external. As a result, creating further legitimation crisis because it's going against itself, it's going against its own self-referentiality. Right? So in real politics, I guess it's unavoidable to not say anything about that. In real politics, the legitimation crisis is always about those external forms. Now, parliamentary democracy, I agree with you. But the problem with the democratic mode of understanding politics is the fact that we must come to terms with the fact that we're always in a legitimation crisis. We cannot worry about it. We just simply have to assume that we're always in a legitimation crisis and deal with accordingly without seeking to resolve it by other forms.
In general, I agree with your position because it is very hard to use even the word democracy the word crisis in a meaningful sense when you talk about democracy. I also think that it's a radical immanence project. Radical immanence. There is no way of, and sometimes you grab, in order to limit this immanence or to stand somewhere, you grab, as you say, some positions outside of the border of democracy or something else. But this is the question. Then we have to ask ourselves: is when what does it mean for a democracy? Is an existing democracy? democracy, to feel itself, or its citizens to feel themselves to be content enough to be able to say, okay, this democracy is working sometimes, you know. There is a moment in which there is this, and this corresponds to the ability of citizens to feel that they have the power in their voice and in their decisions to make some influence in their life. The lack of futility is the problem. The futility is the problem. The sense of uselessness, as your Greek friend, the minister used to say, what's the point of voting? Is the sense of uselessness of the instrument of democracy. This is, for me, the crisis of democracy. Beyond the form of democracy as parliamentary, could also have the same crisis in a direct democracy.
Yeah, I'm more down-to-earth sort of guy. and I think that you can speak about the crisis of democracy in Weimar. No doubt about that, right? And if democracy everywhere is in crisis, let us say Norway right now, as much as in Weimar, then what the hell is the difference? And of course, it's a huge. Well, I know that on some level you could imagine that democracy is always in crisis. I don't even think the Israeli ethnocracy is in crisis. I wish it were, but it's not. What? I said ethnocracy, right? But anyhow, even that could be debated and discussed. So it's just because you and I agree doesn't mean it's the final word on the subject. But in any case, it's not in crisis, whatever the hell it is. I wish it were, but it's not. And Norway is not also. So I think that I would not start out with this idea that it's always in crisis. It's always contestable. It has to legitimate itself. I also would not say that the various mechanisms of democracy are external to it. I mean, that's a very philosophical idea because it's a highly philosophical idea that in a sense, to the philosopher, we have an idea of democracy, and then any one of these forms somehow is so different than it really is that it must be external. I try to, again, be in a very down-to-earth way, say that even nationalist governments are somehow democratic. I even concede to Ernesto, reluctantly, I must say, that populist democracy is too a kind of democracy. I mean, I'm sad about that, but it is. And so, and of course, what is right in what you ask is that if you do believe in democracy, you are facing a task. And that task I try to explain as trying to have a normative model, which ultimately means that the ruled really participate in the business of rule in some really serious and intrinsic way, that this idea should be translated in institutional terms that make this idea less fictional, more real. But that's not a crisis. That's the definition of a project. It's a project we should all have. But in any case, I don't see the existing forms in crisis, even because some people have this project. This project actually could lead to the reconstruction of democracies. I mean, crisis to me means, I think Habermas was quite right about this in the book, which I think was called Legitimation Problems and not Legitimation Crisis. He was quite right, is that a system is in crisis if we actually get too close to the threshold principles which would actually involve a transition from that system to another. And I started with Weimar. I think that Weimar democracy was obviously in crisis because in a 3-year period between 1930 and 1933, it was transformed into an authoritarian system. I mean, that to me was a crisis. But it's not the only example, of course.
So I guess I hear, I thought I heard a huge disagreement. I thought that what Andrew was doing by giving the normative term to love is to try to dissuade us from looking at every moment in which there is some distrust of democracy as really a crisis of democracy. Maybe a crisis of something, but since he thinks there's no alternative, he thinks crisis talk, as I understood it, is being abused. And I kind of agree with that. And I hear the abuse in the following way. I thought Nadia's initial bracketing, namely that we could talk about a crisis of democracy wholly independent of economic issues, as simply systematically, you said there are two dimensions and you want to focus on one.
On that, but they say that without, however, I presume, however, that we never keep them apart. The question is, I have to start somewhere, and I use the
But I understand the issue as the question of crisis, I understand as a question of, you say futility, I say trust. At what point do we have a trust in those institutions, and what are the grounds for distrust? And I take it the grounds for distrust is powerlessness. And the source of the powerlessness has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with capital. I mean, I take it there is, I'll use my strange example, my single favorite page from H.L.A. Hart on law, where he says the genius of liberal democracy, right, is the idea of a monopoly over legitimate violence. He says there's only one problem. As long as there's systemic inequality, that monopoly over violence is a form of oppression and will be a form of society attacking half of itself. I take it that we have all these permutations in democracy, not because we trust or don't trust democracy, it's because we cannot live with the system of productions we have, and our politics are inadequate to it. So we go from one to another rather randomly, but I don't see any analytic purpose in thinking that this is really about varieties of the ways of thinking about democracy. These are movements of desperation about powerlessness of the relationship between politics and economics. So there isn't a crisis of democratic legitimation. There's a social crisis, which is something very different.
You know, in the 70s, when we used to look for crisis in books rather than in reality, we have gone through all the steps, right? The falling rate of profit, overproduction, underconsumption. It was quite an interesting exercise, since he's a great writer, and some of his followers, like Rosa Luxemburg, Hilferding, were all great writers and writing interesting stuff. And of course, we were doing this in the midst of an unprecedented boom of the capitalist economies, which showed no signs of succumbing to any of these 3 or 4 phenomena I just mentioned. So Kossoff and Jürgen Habermas, just around that period, when we were reading still Marx, thought of a really ingenious solution, which I think is close to what you're saying, actually. Nothing wrong with that, because these were really important authors, and the books remain good, even if they're no longer read, because commodity fetishism in the intellectual world makes people read new and better things, even when older things are still there that are quite useful. But okay, what you're saying is that the political phenomena, which people might perceive as connected to tensions, problems, even potential crisis, are also linked to the fundamental economic and trends, which then are managed as they did. Well, at least this is their theory, which were managed by political institutions, which themselves then take over and open up. And I think this was really an ingenious theory. And what follows after that, which everybody calls, I don't like the term because it's so unidimensional and reductive, neoliberalism. In all the Western countries, there has been a neoliberal reconstruction of capitalism. I don't know, I mentioned Weimar before. Of course, there are other places that could be mentioned. I didn't see any of the late capitalist countries get close to a collapse of political legitimacy or even rationality in this time. So I think, yeah, I think it is true that there are fundamental tensions, problems, and of course they are all linked to injustice in capitalist society. But I think we're not going to find out either by just reading the old books. In this case, I don't mean Offe and Habermas, but I mean Uncle Charlie himself. We're not going to find out what these crises are going to be all about and when they come. And I think we have opportunities which are not necessarily linked to crisis. For example, if one actually thinks about democratic reconstruction, is crisis the best occasion for it? I would say it's not. I would be much more optimistic about the possibilities of democratic change in moments different than, for example, what Greece has undergone now. I think Greece is not in good condition right now to democratically reconstruct its institutions. I think more likely other countries where one can actually differentiate between economic and political phenomena have a better chance to produce alternatives. Now, maybe they won't be motivated. That's the paradox, is that economic crisis provides the motivation. Economic crisis may provide the motivation, but it's a bad opportunity. Yes, we have great opportunities. Norway could make itself into a utopia on earth today because it is so damn rich. But they don't do it. They don't do anything else than social democracy has done for 30 years, or 40, or even more in Norway. So maybe that's a paradox.
I want to be the flat-footed one. I think one of the things that happens in some of these conversations, we have really different vocabularies, and sometimes we pretend it's okay. But actually, sometimes it's actually in our way. Some things don't translate that easily in terms of what the empirical is we're looking at. And sometimes I think for those of us who work sort of ethnographically and historically, the normative gets confused for us, because when I hear the two of you talking, what I hear is a model of thinking democracy that is based on the citizen. That's the word that, isn't that right? And when I think as an ethnographer and an historian, I think of the ways in which democracy can't deal with the non-citizen, with the undocumented, with the reality of that citizenship is just such a limited good. And I know Andrew said, oh, I've already incorporated that, and I'm sure you have. I'm sure it's partly a matter of what's already assumed in your conversation between you, but that I can't assume from where I come from. And it seems as if what you're all talking about is a form of democracy that emanates from what rights the citizen is going to have, rather than what is the sort of face of our world, which is so much about what the non-citizen has or doesn't have. And I'm sure that it's already sort of incorporated into these frames, but it's, the Edmund Morgan that I know is a different one than you know, Andrew. The Edmund Morgan I know is the one who studied the Republic to show that there was no Republic without the exclusions from the very start on which it was based. That's the Edmund Morgan that from the very beginning, it was the non-citizen that defined the Republic. So I just would love to hear you both talk about it and say, of course, or don't, or ignore it, or whatever.
Well, if I may briefly, because this would require a different paper talking precisely about the other movement.
Well, I'm not sure. What I'm arguing is it shouldn't require a different behavior.
No. At least for as far as my frame operates, I would say that there is in the world of democracy a contradiction or a tension between a universalistic afflatus, the idea of inclusion or treating everybody equally, of being universalistic, but there is also a way of making decisions that requires a specific place, a specific number of citizens or a group of people, which is not the globe and not the entire humanity. So this tension is inside of democracy. It's within the body of the word called democracy, which is a complex word. It's not simply making decisions according to majority rule, having one vote. It's also that when we speak about state-based democracy or a geographical definition or the delimitation of, otherwise we should, you're right, that there is, for instance, as soon as democracy becomes embodied in a state or in a nation state, the question of borders, the question of the others, the question of immigrants, the question of exclusion becomes a kind of explosive kind of problem that puts into question the very universalistic principle upon which democracy is based. So this is a true serious tension inside of democracy, but it's inside of democracy in my view. It's not from outside to inside. I don't know.
And I know Foucauldians always resist this question. To the death. To the death they resist it. Namely, the question, what would you do about it? And I could tell you what I would do. You wouldn't like it because you would think it's too reformist, too ameliorative, it improves all, some people create new problems, some again would be excluded. So I know already your answer to my answer. And I recognize that's a good debate. It's a worthwhile debate to have. Lots of things one can do, of course. It's not as if we're out of, but you see, as long as the two of you and others who think, and that's most of my students, of course, who think like this, if you just insist on not giving that answer, you're always in the position of accusing me and Nadia of a new exclusion, and never really saying what your universal inclusion would be like, because if you move to federal states, the problem would come up again. If you have regional organizations like Europe, the problem is right there on European doorstep. Even international organizations, even if it were a community of the globe, which I imagine none of you, Foucault never would have proposed anything like that, none of you, even then you would have the problem of those who really try to bring that community down and who act in such a way which is totally incompatible with all aspects. You know, so what would you do with the ISIS if you had this community of the globe? Would you include them too, and how would you do it? I mean, I know this is something that three-quarters of people here will think is an absurdly conservative answer to you. But really, at one point, just please give me an answer, is what you would do.
I would give you an answer.
Yeah, you, of course, would. But I asked them, not you.
Anne's question was not from a universalist point of view. I think you subsumed her position to a universalist point of view. That's not her case. She made a completely different point. It was not.
I don't even understand what you just said. I don't understand not a single word of it. I understood not a single word of it.
What I said is that Anne's point was not a universalist point. It was not a universalist claim. It was beyond that. It was not
beyond particularism.
No, it was not part of. It was not part of the particular universal distinction. But I'm not going to speak on her behalf. Is the way.
To answer the question, what would you do about the problem of enormous number of people?
No. We have many questions. I just want to clarify this. Now, because
this always happens. Then rhetorical answers are given of all kinds, which then supposed to snow everybody there. But in fact, doesn't snow me.
That's the problem. But let's continue. One question.
It does. I think it's bullshit.
We'll talk more about this. But Dimitri, we are going to take two questions because we have several. So two at the time, Dimitri and Rebecca, and then we have tomorrow.
Okay, this is a question for both Nadia and Andrew. I want to defend in the sense that democracy and democratic legitimacy is in crisis, and I think it should be in crisis. Right? Here, however, it would go against Nadia's reading of crisis as a catastrophe. I don't think that crisis necessarily needs to be catastrophic. Catastrophe is the end of all things. Here, I'm much more with Hegel and Marx, who suggest that without crisis, you would have complete stagnation. Yeah, nothing would move anywhere anymore. So I think crisis is necessary in a sense. And of course, you could say that there are historical crises that lead from one form of legitimacy to another, from worse to the better, to the best. But then I take it that for you, democratic legitimacy is the end of the story. Yeah, that's it. So we are there, we will be there, inevitably there will be no way out. Maybe it's a good thing, right? But also, you yourself suggested in your talk that democratic legitimacy is the only one which is self-reflective. Yeah? And self-reflection is critical self-reflection. And that's, I take it to be the moment of crisis, in a Greek sense, crisis as a judgment, right? So this is a constant way of judging about oneself, so of finding all kind of shortcomings, maybe sometimes inventing them, in order to sort of rejuvenate itself. And so I think that in a sense, democracy is democratic legitimacy is critical, and I think it should be.
Well, that's...
No, just a second. We
Sorry.
have two questions.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Don't much time, yes.
Jay has already posed my question. I just wanted to. Yes, he's already posed my question. It's fine.
Ah, okay. So, Nadia.
I think, answer in a way. The question is not about the exclusion of people who are not part of the demos. The question is about the division within the demos, between those who are taking part in ruling and those who cannot take part in ruling. So my question is this division that is in Greek, inside the Greek concept of democracy, I mean, part of the demos is not counted at all. Is this essential for democracy? If this is the case, then then it's clearly it must be clear that democracy must be in constant crisis, because
Yes.
Okay, and if it is not the case, and if you think that democracy can overcome this split within it, then where there is such a democracy, except for Norway, maybe.
Well, it's not, you know, one can make fun, I'm sorry, oh, sorry, it's not yet my turn. I mean, one can make fun of Norway, but Norway is not Israel. That is for sure. It's not ethnocratic in that way. And as a matter of fact, in answer to some of your questions, Norway has, in fact, quite interesting policies in relationship to integration even of strangers, so, of foreigners. But certainly, one cannot say there's a division as there is between Arab and Jewish citizens of Israel. You know, you have the craziest system with its millets and with its system of political regime. I would not say that this is the typical situation for democracy. There are neither millets in most of them, which divide the population in one way, nor is there an exclusion of a body of the citizens from even the possibility of ever being in a coalition, which is going to happen now, because very likely the Arab parties, the United Parties, will get 13, 14 seats in the Knesset. And I'm sure that even if Herzog wins, they will not be included in any coalition government. That means, of course, that there are two types of citizens in Israel. Right, I fully concede that, but this is the general situation of democracy. And if it's the case, I don't even understand why you would say it, because then the question is, so what would you do to Israel to change it? If Israel could be turned into Norway, would imply no change at all, why would you even engage in politics? I think the thing to do would be to become an artist or a literati.
I have question, my answer. I did not say that crisis is catastrophe. I said different definition of crisis, and I say, picking up from Aristotle, that in relation to democracy, the idea of crisis is a permanent, transformation or change is the only possible way of capture. So I excluded the one. As for minority or groups inside, I think that democracy was always able to find, try to find procedural or institutional way of solving exactly solving that problem. And he did so with the lottery, with direct presence of the people inside the assembly, with the universal suffrage that can be criticized. So, but it is an issue. It is exactly the issue.
No, it's not the issue. It's not. So I was misunderstood.
Oh, okay.
Slaves were not part of the lottery in Athens, right?
No, but
and Palestinians in the West Bank are not part of the coalition problem in Israel. I'm speaking about the people who are outside in principle and cannot be made part of the demos. And there are still those who are governed and ruled and oppressed by the same regime and cannot take part of it. So my question was and of course, and all throughout.
But this is, I understand.
But this is my question was not about Israel. It was about the concept of democracy. Is democracy split in this way in principle?
No.
No, not at all. For this reason,
Answer
it
is
was
no.
a permanent crisis in looking for the institutions able to embody, to incorporate it, to include. That was the fact. Of course, the ancient case is not. It's autochthonous democracy there. I mean, made by the people coming from the earth, and that's not the slaves. We're not coming from that same earth. So it's sometimes different, or sometimes exactly. But this is true. But the way of using the word democracy as inclusion in the decision-making process opened the floor to the criticism of that kind of subjection. And today we are exactly, every time there is a question of inclusion, there is a question of subjection, and democracy is under question. Rightly so, because it is a like of a self-denial of itself when immigrants are not included or immigrants are cast off. Every time you do so from the name of what? You denounce the situation in the name of what? In the name of precisely self-governing power that should have.
Okay, I mean, forget Israel. In the United States, when you had slavery in 1860, what did you want? You wanted to free the slaves, and you wanted to do other things too, if you're a radical Republican. Then under Jim Crow, what did you want to do? And then in the epoch of the Civil Rights Movement, what did you want to do? So, of course, in Israel, what do you want to do? Don't you want to make the Arabs, your co-citizens, equal citizens? Don't you want to actually either have two states or one state? If it's one state, then equal citizenship for Arabs and Jews within the one state. If you don't want those things, what the hell do you want?
We are going to answer this question probably in the next conference. That will include a lexical entry on democracy. We need to do that, but we have to find. Yes, we need to discuss on democracy. We have Nanny and Lydia. And they are the last two because we are late.
Just to make a very short parenthesis here, just to remind us all that demos in ancient Greek actually, I mean, the split was not within, thank you, the split was not within the demos, the split, because the demos did not include anyone who was not an Athenian citizen. So to say that the distinction or the tension existed even within the demos is just inaccurate historically. And also to remind us all the fact that democracy, is a term that actually is being used disparagingly, that in ancient texts, the word demos is the affirmative term, it is not the term democracy. So we might just keep that in mind. But I wanted to actually go back and think along the lines of Annie's question, and also be the other flat-footed one here. And I want to go to the question of crisis as crisis and as critique, and think about the example that you gave, Nadia, of the citizens on Syntagma Square having been fed up completely and crying towards the parliament to burn it. And this is my question. I mean, whether we think of crisis from Koselleck or from Habermas, or whether we think of crisis from Aristotle, or I don't know. I think that there is a problem that, on a certain level, Jean brought up, which is the problem of the grounds on which we actually define or arrive at a definition of consensus, of common understanding, or of sameness, I would say. So the citizens who stood in front of the parliament and yelled, "Burn down the whore of the parliament," this whore of parliament, were primarily the members of the fascist neo-Nazi groups in Athens. This is something that Andrew also in private has mentioned other times. You know, how do you actually separate? How can you tell? How can you see that which is critique from that which actually produces what Koselleck would say, a non-productive crisis, right? So what is it that separates, that allows us, and this is where Annie and I are standing on the same leg, right? And we in anthropology have faced that. We know how we can go about to think about how to help us understand who is the neo-Nazi, who is the one who wants to burn down the parliament and not replace it with anything, who is the non-democratic citizen. But what is the approach that, I want to ask you to think interdisciplinarily here. What is the approach that you can give us from political theory or sociology to think about this particular problem, right? I mean, how can we actually tell who is the friend or the enemy of democracy, and in cases of such overt positionalities? Thank you.
Okay. So slightly different tone. I was very taken by Jay's question about this inadequacy of democracy as government to confront an economic inequality. And it made me think of some of the recent rhetoric of what it means to bring democracy to a country that hasn't had it. You know, they were trying it in Iraq and, you know, through American militarism and so on. And it occurred to me when there was a lot of that rhetoric that democracy had become a very emptied concept, that there was nothing left. It was just a meaningless American flag-waving piece of bullshit that was being taken to a country without realizing that democracy is built from the ground up. You know, let's throw posters of democracy over Iraq. And so my question is, in your views, how much is democracy actually meant to include now? Is it an issue of just citizenship, of just governance? Does it include military organization, economic organization? If Jay's question is right and your questions is right, it seems to be asking for a limit to be put on the concept of democracy to recognize that it can't actually do all the work we want it to do.
Few lines, and then on the question of economics. Of course, we have to anticipate when we talk about democracy that some economic conditions for democracy must be there, because democracy cannot exist if people have no self-dependence abilities to take care of themselves in their own everyday life. That is the quintessential condition, and thus a democracy that is unable to do so, it limits itself, and actually it reverts against itself, its own. So it's important, the two situations, economic and politics, we separate in order to analyze them, but they are not separated. I agree on that with Rousseau when he used to say, you know, there is a condition minimal of equality that needs to be. This should be an ideal criteria in relation to which we are able to criticize the factual reality of our existing democracy. This is true. Well, according to, this is not my field, but many political scientists, some political scientists, they think that democracy, majority rule, opinion making, blah, blah, actually was not so able to introduce element of particularly in Latin American countries or in non-European countries, of redistribution. They were not able to deliver justice, of just society or social justice. So, but this is an issue that it's important, but would need a kind of different approach. As for Nene, yes, of course, there were also perhaps not Nazis there. Who knows? I don't know. I read the newspapers, they were not simply Nazis, and not only them, other people also. This is not a scandal for me that we shout against the parliament. It's part of the game in some sense. Not even is a scandal that there are fascists around. This is part of the game. And this is a way for us to be more and more assertive and more able to enter in this competition with them. This is the risky game, but this is the democratic game. So we cannot eliminate those we think that they can be dangerous in the future, because in this case we eliminate everybody. So this is not what the democracy, in my view at least, for this reason the appeal to procedures makes me come to this outcome of inclusion in the political game, also of the enemies in some sense.
You know, maybe because in my country too, there is a very powerful fascist movement, almost as strong as New Dawn. I'm a little more militant in relationship to them than Nadia is. You know, in Italy, you know, Italy, it's a memory now. You know,
no, it's not a memory.
His granddaughter runs for parliament, and Fini turns out to be one of the great defenders of liberal freedoms in parliament against Berlusconi. So in a country like that, maybe you're not as worried as, let's say, as Greeks and Hungarians might be worried. But this is not the essential point. I think the last few questions actually targeted a different topic, which historically is linked to our topic, democracy, namely the topic of the nation state. Historically, it was mostly nation states, although the United States is a little different, that modern democracy as we know it, with all its faults and all its gaps between fiction and reality, have developed. And I think from Anne on, the questions really began to target, and I think this is true for the last few questions, target this issue, whether this frame is the right frame to solve any political questions, including the problem of democracy. And I think it's not. I agree in this respect with the questioners. I don't agree with the pupils of Habermas like Ben Habib and others who think that cosmopolitan arrangements are already here. That's really ridiculous. Yes, there are some cosmopolitan elements in international law. There are some institutions which are dedicated to those matters. But to say that this is our reality is absurd, given what we see all over the place. But I think we do have to think beyond this nation-state frame. Now, whether we do it completely outside of democracy or not, I think is another question. Because I think most of us here would think that whatever regional, international structures we develop, they too then should fall under a democratic logic. I mean, what? They should be authoritarian, or they should be exclusionary, or they should be based on ethnic groups. I mean, of course, all of us immediately will adopt the democratic conception in order to try to see how these institutions, whether it is a World Bank or IMF or anything else, could be transformed. And of course, they all need transformation. Plus, building new ones too, I think we'd have to raise the question whether, what political form they should have. They're not just going to be cosmopolitan as such, they're going to be cosmopolitan if they will ever exist in some political form. And I think in that sense, we're still in the age of democracy. I don't think anybody in this room could imagine any other form for any of these things than democratic. I mean, if you can, please say so. Say what that is. I am sure not a single person in this room will come up with an alternative form of organization for Europe, let us say, except a more democratic one. The current one obviously has a huge democratic deficit. So reconstruct Europe. So what would you do? Make it authoritarian? Let a new Napoleon run it? What? It would have to be democratic.
Okay, let's finish in this note and
we're obviously having a lot of fun here, which is why we're an hour late.
We have only 1 hour then for lunch?
No, we will move the entire program an hour later, so people will come back here at 2:45. After all, we're missing a speaker in the afternoon, so we're actually going to make.
When are we going to end this afternoon?
It will end exactly at the time.
Same time.
Yeah, absolutely. So the